In March 1809, the Paris Opéra premiered a rather peculiar opera, La Mort d'Adam. In lieu of a more traditional plot from ancient history or mythology, the libretto was based on an event from the Bible, the death of Adam at the respectable age of 930 years. In Act 1, an angel confirms Adam's premonition that death will take him soon, and the rest of the tragedy depicts Adam's interactions with his progeny. Here you see there, briefly translated, the angel coming down to say that he will die before the sun will go down. At the end of the opera, Adam finally succumbs after having all of the interactions with his progeny, and he is welcomed into heaven in a grandiose apotheosis scene. According to the critics, the lack of action and variety in this plot caused many audience members to doze off. But the final apotheosis, quote, electrified the assembly, end of quote. The scene was showered with praise. The spectacle is of a magnificence difficult to imagine. It is possible that nothing this beautiful has ever been presented at the Opéra. The most delightful and enchanting spectacle that has ever adorned our operatic stage. Briefly summarizing this scene, the critic of the Petite Affiche also described the forceful impact of this scenic illusion. All the parts of the heaven opened one by one, he writes. Abel's ghost came down to search for his father and take him to the realm of happiness and immortality. It is impossible to imagine the magnificent sets which surprise, seduce, enchant, and transport the soul into the sanctuary of beatitude itself. Even though some critics predicted a long run for this opera on account of its spectacular apotheosis, it disappeared from the repertory after only 16 performances. As a result, La Mort d'Adam has received hardly any scholarly attention. If mentioned, it is described, somewhat hyperbolically, as the unfortunate flop that ended Lesueur's operatic career. While this opera might seem like nothing more than a footnote in operatic history, in this paper I will argue that its final apotheosis provides new insights into how artists dealt with the hackneyed convention of the lieto fine, or the happy ending. A recent edited volume on the lieto fine around 1800 shows that while more and more operas were ending tragically around this time, the opera still largely held on to this convention. This was in part because its productions were famous for their final divertissement, in which grandiose choruses and ballets were combined with extravagant sets and machines used for the appearances of the gods and the supernatural creatures, also called le merveilleux. Such endings had nevertheless been severely criticized for their unrealistic nature and gratuitous spectacle. Today, I want to suggest that the biblical apotheosis, of which La Mort d'Adam is a prime example, provided one way to create a more realistic lieto fine by combining a tragic death with a more plausible and simultaneously spectacular appearance of the divine. As a bonus, these lieti fine were suitable to the political situation as well. This intermingling of politics and religion on the opera's secular stage, I suggest, contributed in the end to the demise of the happy ending in the 1820s. And simultaneously, they stimulated the trend towards an aestheticization of the religious experience and created fertile ground for an almost religious veneration of art and artists. In 1801, Lesueur published an extensive treatise on La Mort d'Adam, which was an extensive defense of La Mort d'Adam in his Lettres en réponse à Guillard. He sought to convince the reader that his new opera could reinvigorate the French operatic tradition. At the time, the repertory at the Paris Opéra consists primarily of tragédies lyriques from the 1770s and 1780s by Christophe Willibald Gluck and his contemporaries. Most of the new works from the previous decade had failed to gain critical acclaim and had disappeared after a few performances. So this is just a list of all of the operas with a total of performances here. Sorry, I should have titled the columns. This is a total of performances between 1789 and 1801, and all the ones that are sort of slightly lightly colored in blue are works that premiered before the revolution. So you see that only very few operas that were created after the revolution actually had a considerable number of performances. And Castor et Pollux is sort of, it's not really a post-revolutionary work, as they reprised the Quinault libretto. Not the Quinault libretto, but the libretto used by Rameau for his Castor et Pollux. That Lesueur hoped to breathe new life into French opera with a work based on biblical event is peculiar, to say the least. First, the Bible was a more obvious source for church music and oratorios than for operatic plots. Moreover, while the operatic theatre was often considered a place for compositional innovation, church music had the reputation of being conservative and old-fashioned. As a consequence, it was more common for composers to borrow techniques from opera to renovate church music than the other way around. And this is exactly what Lesueur did at the Notre Dame in the 1780s. Second, the religious situation in France around 1800 was complicated. During the Ancien Régime, Catholicism had been the state religion, and on religious holidays, theaters closed because stage performances had been prohibited. These restrictions disappeared after the French Revolution, when the government also systematically attempted to de-Christianize all areas of society. In 1794, Robespierre had even established an alternative civic religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. Yet Christian worship never really disappeared, and after Robespierre's death in late 1794, it could slowly come back above ground again. In July 1801, when Napoleon signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, Roman Catholicism was re-established, not as a state religion, but as the religion of the majority of France, thus preserving religious freedom. Since 1794 was the year in which Christianity was most endangered, it is quite surprising that this is precisely the year when 2 biblical libretti were presented for performance at Parisian opera theaters. La Mort d'Adam by Lesueur at the Opéra, which we have talked about before, and La Mort d'Abel at the Théâtre Feydeau. In his Lettres, however, Lesueur claimed that La Mort d'Adam was not a devotional tragedy, nor one representing a particular religion or religious extremism. Instead, he underlined that quote, the warm, elevated, and burning passions of the souls are the main topic treated by Guillard, his librettist, end of quote. And this plot is also, quote, founded on all kinds of love, on natural religion, and on death, end of quote. With its focus on human passions and the experience of the divine through nature, La Mort d'Adam's libretto closely followed the sentimentalist approach to religion in its principal source, Friedrich Gottlob Klopstock's Der Tod Adams of 1757. This approach, focused on the human aspects of religion's experience rather than interventions of the divine, had become quite popular throughout Europe in the 18th century. An emphasis on the human experience rather than divine intervention was also central to French Enlightenment visions of theatre, which strongly influenced Lesueur's operatic aesthetics. Authors such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire had advocated the development of a more natural and lifelike theatre that could engage the audiences in a profound emotional manner. Such theatre would largely shy away from the merveilleux, which according to them was too often used merely as a source for gratuitous and dramatically unmotivated spectacle. Indeed, the initial version of La Mort d'Adam seems to have observed this criticism so carefully that it hardly included anything merveilleux. In addition to the appearance of the angel in Act 1, which we saw at the very beginning, and which was also already present in Klopstock's original, it only added a brief final chorus for some angels, which you see here. Nonetheless, the merveilleux remained an essential feature of French opera. The Napoleonic era in particular had witnessed a growing obsession with extravagant theatrical effects. A solution for this tension between the need for merveilleux on the one hand and greater verisimilitude on the other could be found in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie. The author of the entry on the merveilleux argued that whether or not the supernatural comes across as realistic to the audiences depends on their particular beliefs. While the Greek deities seem entirely fantastic now, he stated, one could, quote, imitate just the wonders, merveilles, that religion offers, end of quote. For example, in John Milton's Paradise Lost, angels and demons could be credible characters for a Christian audience. It was exactly to Milton's Paradise Lost that Lesueur and Guillard turned when sometime after 1801 they expanded the final chorus of La Mort d'Adam into an elaborate apotheosis. While no text is directly copied from Milton's epic, the famed poem did inspire the battle between Satan and the angels over Adam's soul in the finale. Moreover, in an early libretto version of the scene, Lesueur specified that the stage sets should, quote, depict heaven in all its magnificence as described in Milton and the Book of Revelation. And this is the version, the early libretto version of that apotheosis. While providing a more credible merveilleux to the opera's largely Christian audiences, the apotheosis also satisfied the need for an extravagant final divertissement. The use of Milton's poem specifically promised unparalleled spectacle, as it had already previously been associated with innovative theatrical entertainments. In the second half of the 18th century, it inspired several Parisian theater makers to elaborate representations of hell and heaven. And these are only two of the handful examples that I've actually found about this. It's quite interesting. One of them is called Spectacle de peinture mécanique et musique. And the other one, well, it doesn't really have a title, but it's performed at the Salle des Machines, which was often used for spectacles that required a lot of mechanistic effects. Moreover, the Pandemonium had also been shown as a mini-kinetic scene at Philippe de Lotterbourg's at the Fusicon in London, of which this is the only watercolor that is surviving. And you actually see a little angel or, well, devil, you don't really know, but a sort of winged figure and a lot of fire. So it is possible that this is actually the representation. I have not found any literature on people that identify the scene, but I think it could be possible. And finally, around 1800, it was a basis for a scene in Gaspar Robertson's Phantasmagoria. It was indeed Lesueur's intent to create an innovative, astounding scene, and more specifically, to exceed the dream spectacle that he had created in Océan ou les Bardes of 1804. That opera's Act 4 dream had been praised in the press as an absolute fairy tale and a ravishing novelty. According to the composer, however, La Mort d'Adam will, quote, will certainly have a much more pompous and brilliant spectacle than Océan, end of quote. As the quotes at the beginning of this paper indicate, Adam's apotheosis had indeed surpassed Océan's dream. With its 40 minutes, the apotheosis lasted twice as long as its bardic predecessor. It employed 134 singers and dancers dressed as angels and demons, in comparison to only 111 bards on stage in Océan. In addition, it featured several pyrotechnic effects for the representation of hell, and according to the machinists, an even grander construction to depict heaven than Océan's 38-foot-high aerial palace. While no depictions of the sets remain, an early description by Lesueur suggests that this construction should look like an engraving in the Bible printed by Mortier in 1700. And so these are a few of the costume designs for the chorus, and this is the Bible etch that Lesueur was indicating. I was able to track down this engraving, and indeed the scene descriptions in the score request a circle of angel and celestial spirits, a golden altar shining in a blazing backlight, and crowned with a radiating rainbow. The appearance of heaven is also sonically impressive. Announced with double forte trumpets calls, accompanied by woodwind, strings, timpani, and thunder, which will be missing in the recording, the thunder, and an invisible unisono chorus ordering the demons to disappear. This is going to be a bit loud. goes on for quite a while. Le Sueur was not the first to exploit Milton's poem to create a spectacular operatic final divertissement. The other biblical opera, written around 1794, La Mort d'Abel, had from its very conception included scenes of merveilleux based on Paradise Lost. The entire second act of this libretto is a battle between Satan and his subjects over Cain's soul. And the opera ends with an apotheosis as well, though a less extravagant one than Adam's. The librettist François Benoît Hoffmann accused Le Sueur of plagiarism. After all, he had shown the text to the composer in the 1790s, and the first versions of Adam did not contain an apotheosis. The dispute demonstrates how important the search for original merveilleux effects and finales was to the success of an opera. After all, when Abel premiered in 1810, a year after Adam, critics were not impressed with its final scene. To save costs, the opera had also reused some of the sets and costumes for Adam, further diminishing the impact of its novelty, and Abel disappeared from the stage after 10 performances only. These apotheoses, however, were not just aesthetically motivated, they also carried significant political weight during Napoleon's reign. As several critics remarked, the apotheosis was not a Christian symbol, but a pagan one. Diderot d'Alembert's encyclopédie specified that the apotheosis in ancient Greece had served to, quote, deify princes, heroes, and the inventors of arts, end of quote. It is well known that Napoleon enthusiastically exploited ancient Greek and Roman imagery to propagandistic ends. Thus, it is not surprising that he had used the apotheosis to that end as well. In Constance Meyer's and Pierre-Paul Proudhon's painting L'apothéose de Napoléon Bonaparte, premier consul de la République, which you can see here, the transition from the consulate to the empire is depicted as an apotheosis. The apotheosis is also propagandistically used in Anne-Louis Giraudet' L'apothéose des héros français, which glorifies patriotic martyrdom by showing how the Scottish bard Ossian welcomes generals from Napoleon's armies and from revolutionary armies into the afterlife. In another paper, I have suggested that this painting in part inspired the design of the dream scene in Le Sueur's Ossian ou les Bardes, the exact scene that the apotheosis of Adam was supposed to emulate. Napoleon did not, however, limit himself to capitalizing on classical mythology and history. He had used the Concordat of 1801, which recognized Catholicism as the majority religion in France, to enhance his popularity with his Catholic subjects and other Catholic leaders in Europe. Since becoming emperor, Napoleon relied even more on religious imagery to lend legitimacy to his reign. Kings in France had traditionally received their power from God. Yet Napoleon had received his title of consul for life through a plebiscite. When becoming emperor of the French, he famously crowned himself during the coronation ceremony rather than allowing the Pope to do so. Nevertheless, the fact that the ceremony was a bricolage of Catholic imagery and symbols demonstrates that he still relied on religion to strengthen his legitimacy. This became ever clearer in 1806 when the emperor instated the Feast of Saint Napoleon, an obscure Roman martyr originally called Neopolus. The date of the feast, August 15th, coincided not only with the celebration of the Assumption of Mary, a Christian equivalent to the pagan apotheosis, but it conveniently was also the emperor's own birthday. After 1806, images of the saint sometimes invoked the emperor's likeness, and the emperor's depictions also regularly evoked symbols of sainthood, as you see in the image on the right. While La Mort d'Adam and La Mort d'Abel were not originally written to glorify the emperor, they contributed to the self-sacralizing images that were called upon with ever greater frequency towards the end of Napoleon's reign. According to David Chailloux, Adam's apotheosis was specifically added to liken Napoleon to the first man on earth. Such images served as a counterweight to the signs of political decline that surfaced around 1809 when Adam premiered. The war against Spain started in 1808, had not been a brief victorious campaign as Napoleon hoped, but devolved into a vicious guerrilla battle, provoking much criticism, as Sarah Hibbert will also talk about later. Napoleon's decision to divorce Josephine had also, once it became public knowledge, caused an avalanche of criticism among France's enemies and Parisians alike. Against the backdrop of these politically troubled times, these apotheoses provided exalted images of hope and optimism, elements essential to Napoleon's propaganda. And even if such endings were incapable of instilling optimism, at least they could deflect attention from reality for a brief moment, a function of art the government valued as well. Thus, studying these operas highlights one manner in which artists sought to solve the problem of the lieto fine around 1800. The extreme extravagance of their final apotheoses suited both the aesthetic of the Napoleonic government and a more general need for the merveilleux, while also being conceivably more realistic. Yet, they were unsuccessful in establishing a new norm, as by the late 1820s, lieti fine were largely replaced with tragic cataclysms such as the volcanic explosion and Fenella's suicide in La Muette de Portici of 1828. Such cataclysms provided the same opportunity for large choruses and novel scenic effects, and they satisfied the growing appetite for tragic endings. The fall of Napoleon and subsequent humiliation of France at the Congress of Vienna had probably contributed to the growth of this appetite, as they had significantly undermined the nation's belief in a glorious future. Thus, as final resurrections of a convention that would soon disappear, these apotheoses can be seen as standing at the end of a tradition. Nevertheless, the biblical operas participated in new developments as well. They are witnesses to the ever-growing permeability between the religious, the secular, and the political, which had its roots in the Revolution. In his Génie du Christianisme of 1801, Chateaubriand had advocated for the importance of Christianity in the progress of the arts, and in particularly praised several works, such as Milton's Paradise Lost, for their aesthetic translation of the religious experience. Operas like Adam and Abel helped normalize such aestheticizations in the secular context of the opera stage. Now, this development is not necessarily a very straight and linear development. For example, there will still be a lot of 19th century discussions about especially institutional religion and also religious rituals that come from the church, and even the use of religious music. Now, this was all not the case with La Mort d'Adam, which had newly composed music and which was also drawing on the Old Testament, which technically was slightly less problematic than the New Testament to take inspiration from. And also, the sources were both literary, so Klopstocks, which was a tragedy, and then Milton, which was also an epic poem. But nevertheless, there is this sort of proliferation of biblical theater around the time, as Barbara will also talk about the popularity of biblical melodrama. Now, these biblical operas are simultaneously also witnesses to the increasing use of religious imagery and language in descriptions of the experience of opera and the image of composers. In his Lettres, Lesueur called the opera a temple, the term for a religious building after the separation between state and church in the Revolution. And he explained in that letter that he expected a religious audience experience of his opera. And to that end, he probably also filled all of his works, even the non-biblical ones like Ossian, with religious symbolism. This is perhaps not a surprise, because he started out as a church composer. Nevertheless, reviewers started to use a lot of words previously connected to religious experiences to describe their experience of opera as well. The review quoted at the beginning of this paper described the experience of Adam's apotheosis as, quote, transporting the soul into the sanctuary of beatitude. And another critic spoke of an ecstasy. The latter word was defined in the Encyclopédie as a theological term for, quote, a ravishment of the mind that makes all the functions of one's senses be suspended. And they have as the prime example St. Paul, the ecstasy of St. Paul. Yet, according to a newspaper of 1804, a similar experience befell Lesueur when an approaching military band called him to become a composer. He was said to experience a ravishing sensation too vivid for his feeble organs, and it's also described that he fainted. Similar images would become ubiquitous in the 19th century veneration of artists and their art. Investigations into the origin of the messianic artist image and Kunstreligion, or art religion, tend to highlight their German roots. Recently, Nicole Heinkel's and Smille and Bernd Aueroch's books have traced Kunstreligion back to German religious sentimentalism of the second half of the 18th century and its literary products. Our work study even highlights the reception of Klopstock as a heilige dichter, a holy poet. Yet Klopstock's biblical dramas, like his Tod Adams, which was the source for Lesueur's La Mort d'Adam, never made it to the stage. The biblical operas I have talked about today, and the cultural context of their reception, I hope have offered a new window to how French transpositions of this German sentimentalism and the complicated negotiations between politics religious and the secular art during the Napoleonic era deserve attention in these larger 19th century developments. Thank you.